So what we're looking at here is the Green Tara Sadhana. That's a liturgy, practice liturgy, Tantric Buddhist practices that many people will be familiar with. So I usually say this at the beginning. How should one listen to the teachings? Well, if you refer to the text by Patrul Rinpoche, and there's something called the 3 faults of the pot. This is something you really need to know about. It says when you're listening to teachings, you shouldn't have these 3 faults. The first of these 3 faults is that of the pot that is turned upside down. So if you want to put some yogurt in your bowl, and the bowl is turned upside down, it doesn't matter how much yogurt you pour on top, and none will go into the receptacle. And what this is referring to is that if you're attending teachings, but you're there, but you're not paying attention, then it doesn't matter how much the teacher teaches the Dharma, then none of it will penetrate into your mind stream. So Patrul Rinpoche says, don't be like a bowl turned upside down. Be a bowl that is upright, that is ready to receive the Dharma. The second fault of the pot is a pot that has a hole in it or a crack in it. And so if you were to partake of some yogurt and you're given a bowl, but the bowl has a crack in it, if you fill that up with yogurt, then it's all just going to leak out. And so what it says here is don't be like this bowl that has a crack in it. That means you have to retain what is taught. And in order to retain what's taught, then most of us, we have to revise. We have to look at the text again and again. And this way we won't forget what's been taught. Because it's of no use to us if we learn the Dharma and then at a later point we forget it. And then the third fault of the pot is a pot that is mixed with poison, that has poison in it. So you could have a bowl, it looks perfectly fine, but it has some food poisoning or poison in it. And then when you put yogurt into that bowl, then what happens is that yogurt becomes contaminated. It becomes itself like poison. And what this is referring to is that if you're listening to the Dharma or you're studying the Dharma and it's mixed with the negative emotions, for example, greed, anger, ignorance, jealousy, pride, etc., then even if you receive the Dharma, and it's not going to be something that's going to help you or benefit you in any way, in the end, this Dharma itself will become like poison. For example, some people, they study to become kind of learned so they can make lots of money or become famous. That's really important. So as usual, then, the first class, I generally give a kind of sample teaching to introduce the subject matter. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what this is that we're studying. In English, the term is like a liturgy, I suppose. So we call it something like you do in a church. You sing and you perform. It's called a puja or sadhana. Actually, sadhana is associated with practice. So a sadhaka is like a practitioner, a yogic practitioner, etc. Now, sadhana is, in Tibetan, the term is actually chuta. So it means a method for accomplishing the Dharma. So these are methods. This is really important to understand. In general, these sadhanas are associated with what we call the taplam. So that is the path of method. If we look at where this sadhana came from, if we look at its history, then we can trace it back to about the 6th century. And if you know a little bit about Buddhism, then you'll know that the Tantric form of Buddhism, so these kind of deity meditation practices, came much later. Initially, there was basically a monastic community at the time of the Buddha, and we associate this with the Theravadic tradition. And around the 2nd or 3rd centuries BCE, then there was a split. And at that time, formed the kind of, the basis of the division between what is called the Hinayana and the Mahayana, or the Theravadic and the Mahayana. Now, most Buddhists these days are Mahayana Buddhists, because the vast majority of Buddhists are in China. But from this split into the Theravadic and the Mahayana, then eventually we also got what we call Vajrayāna Buddhism, and that is very much associated with these deity images. Many people say that this is essentially a Hindu practice. It's adopted, or it's a corruption of Buddhism. If you look at the works of many modern anthropologists, and they suggest that Tibetan Buddhism isn't real Buddhism, but they took on the sort of aspects of Hindu practice. The outer aspects or in many cases are very similar. You could almost say identical, except for the imagery looks different slightly. It's stylistic, right? But in terms of what you actually do, then the methods, then they seem to be the same. The difference primarily is in regards to the view of the actual practice. And there's a huge difference between the Hindu tradition and the Tibetan Buddhist middle way presentation. So the first references, most people think these are, for example, Tara. Tara is one of these sort of Mahadevas from the Hindu practice. And most people think, well, it's a Hindu practice. If we look at the first appearance of Tara, though, it appears in a Buddhist text, and that's the Mandrusya Mulakalpa. And that's like 5th or 6th century of the Common Era. So it's quite likely that it first appeared in Buddhism, and then it became sort of commonplace in Hindu tradition as well. But that's going back quite a long way. But what we know, though, now is that Tara is one of the most popular sadhanas or pujas that exists. And we can see this because Tara, this goddess, also exists in, for example, Japanese Zen tradition, Korean Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. So her kind of popularity is spread throughout the Buddhist world. It's not something we tend to think exclusively associated with the Tibetan Tantric tradition. So there's two. There's the Mandrusya Mulakalpa, this text, and what was called the Guya Samaja Tantra. And in these then Tara is referred to. So I'll have to explain a little bit about what we mean by Tantra, I think. In general, when people hear about Tantra in the West, then they get all kinds of ideas. They think it's got something to do with this kind of Hindu sexual practice, and that's about it, really, if you talk to everyday worldly people who don't know much about spirituality. Tantric practice is mostly associated with this kind of deity visualization. It's what we call creation stage practice. There's two, creation stage and completion stage. Exactly what the completion stage is kind of difficult, but creation stage is very simple. You create, with your imagination, you're creating or developing a deity and its mandala. And this is what is meant by creation stage. And again, as I said, it's part of the path of method. So it's a method. And the reason why I say that, or I emphasize that, is it's important to understand that this is not ultimate. It's not an ultimate teaching. For example, we don't teach ultimately that these deities exist as real external things, for example, as they do in the Hindu tradition. Does that mean they do not appear? No, it does not mean that they do not appear, because as we know, for very advanced tantric practitioners, they actually encounter these deities, and they encounter them as being very real. Those are really good practitioners. So we often associate, it's like I say, it's part of Buddhist tradition, but it's also part of Hindu tradition, and what we call this sort of path of bhakti, a kind of devotional path. So the devotional aspect is actually really important in tantric practice. In general, we think, okay, Buddhism, it's like science of religion. You have to be very logical, and you don't give rise to blind faith, etc. But in particular, when it comes to creation state practices, these tantric sadhanas, then the element of devotion is very important. But that devotion is not founded on blind faith. You have to have what's called informed faith, and once the informed faith has developed, then you practice that with fervor. So it's not correct to think that we're just given this deity and think, okay, that's the deity, I've got to accept that exists, I don't do anything against the deity, I'm going to hell. That kind of mentality is not going to work. Sadly, though, most practitioners never develop informed faith. It's just too difficult. They haven't got the opportunity to study, and so they can't develop informed faith. And I'm talking about in the West mainly. And then they come to the temple in the West, and they see all these pictures, I think, wow, that looks beautiful. Who's that? That's Green Tara. Who's that? That's Chenrezig, etc. And then they kind of just fall into this kind of tradition we have of just believing in stuff without thinking about it. So how would we develop informed faith for a deity in the tantric practice? Well, the clue there is in one of these chants that we commonly chant at the beginning of all tantric practices, Om Spa Shuddha Savar Dhamma Spa Shuddha Hong, which means that everything is emptiness, everything becomes emptiness. So what we see from that is that all Vajrayāna practices founded primarily on a basis of at least understanding, but preferably experience and realization in the truth of emptiness. And then on top of that, then you develop the mandala of the deity as the appearing aspect. So in general, in Buddhism, we talk about method and wisdom. We talk about the provisional truth. We talk about the ultimate truth. We talk about the male and female deities. Really, these all refer to the same thing. What do they refer to? They refer to the synthesis of appearance and emptiness. Or you could say bliss emptiness. Or you could say clarity emptiness. They're not different. Now, we conceptualize these things, appearance, emptiness, as being separate, somehow to be two sides of a coin. But the reality is these are inseparable. They're not something different. And this is where the view of Vajrayāna Buddhism becomes very specific and different than other traditions. So as you will know, we believe in something called the middle way. That is the middle way between the two extremes. And if you watch one of my previous videos, I explained there's a middle way of view, meditation, and conduct. So in terms of conduct, that middle way is something different. But in terms of view, it's the view that is free of the extremes of existence and non-existence. Permanence and nihilism, you could say. So to give you an example, then believing a deity to be real and external, right, is an indication of a view of permanence or existence. So it's a non-Buddhist view. So we see this deity and we think, like God is permanent, God is all-powerful, always been there, always will be there, pre-exists the universe. We have this kind of view of a deity. That's a mistaken view in Buddha Dharma. So when we look at Tara, then we have to understand, this deity appears, but is not substantially real. Then the practice becomes a Buddhist practice that's in harmony of the view of the middle way and Vajrayāna Buddhism. So it's a big topic. It's really complicated, but we have to have some kind of way of entering into this practice. So what I'm saying is that in general, if you study the Tara Sadhana, in fact, most people don't study, right? They show up at their Dharma center and they see all these cool tankas and it's all this bright imagery and it's all overwhelming. And they say, what's that? Oh, it's Chandra. What's that? Why is that one red? Why is that one green? And then they say, okay, come tomorrow morning at 6 and we're going to do Tara Puja. And we sort of think, what's Tara? Oh, Tara is the goddess. She's the protectress. She'll save you. If you say this mantra, Om Tara Tu Tara Tu. So then any harm, you'll be free from any harm. That's what we do. We go in and then we don't really study it. We just kind of follow along with what everybody else is doing. And primarily we think about where do we ring the bell? Where do we say the mantra? And then if we do it in the wrong place, we get embarrassed. And when we can do it, we think, hey, I know this practice. That's how we study it, right? But really, in order to enter into this path of tantric practice, then first we have to study why things are empty, why appearance and emptiness are inseparable, these sorts of things. We have to look at the view of the middle way. That means studying Nagarjuna, right? And then we want to look at things like the Jonang view, which is a slightly, we could say higher level view than the middle way Prasangika view. Of course, not everybody agrees. Some people say the Prasangika is the highest view, and some people say this autonomous school is the higher view. But anyway, we're not going to get into that. That's too complicated. So the deity itself appears, but is free of substantial existence. Now, this is the view we're aiming for. This is the practice we're aiming for. Now, the problem is it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult for us to study to the point where we thoroughly understand this view. Then it's even more difficult to develop experience in that. It's even more difficult to develop realization in that. So what happens in general is then we enter in with good intention and then we kind of fake it to make it, as they say. And we remember, it's the path of method. So we use these various techniques in order for us to augment our own meditation, also to generate the view. Like you could study a little bit about how things are empty, and then you could do a bit of your practice. And those will work in harmony with each other. And at some point, your understanding and your experiences in your practice will kind of coalesce, and you'll have these real kind of experiences or insights into the meaning. So we kind of use it in tandem. That's a really important thing to understand.